Hi, this is a presentation by 4 Elements CIC called Untold Stories Cornwall, and this is a National Lottery Heritage funded project. So if you would like more on the topic of this project, which is Black Cornish history, and also we have another one on women's Cornish history, then you can actually get these publications from Hypatia Trust. Or you can message us if you are a school, and we will send you free resources so that you can actually have a PDF of the full books. For this presentation, I'm just going to fly through a brief overview of Black Cornish history. Black Cornish history is fascinating, and when we did the research for this project, we uncovered lots of untold stories. So we have dated this basically from the Black Tudors, which, as you can see, starts around the 1500s, where you have African diaspora moving to Cornwall. And that's when that sort of started, and when we can see on parish records, we can see marriages, births, baptisms, and we can see there that they're recorded. And then we go through the transatlantic slave trade period. And interestingly, we found a little known fact, which is that the first known British slave ship carrying Africans left from Truro in Cornwall in 1562. This was slightly earlier than the period which we know as the transatlantic slave trade. So this was one of the earliest recorded ships that we know that went and actually collected around 300 Africans. So that starts our sort of journey through the transatlantic slave trade. We also touch on other issues like piracy, where 30% of the pirate population were black, and that was around sort of the golden age of piracy, of which, of course, Cornwall was rifely involved in around 1600s and 1700s. Then we have black merchants, which represented about 3%, which actually diversified the Cornish ports. So around 60 plus were Cornish. We think that around sort of 1790 that actually docks like Falmouth were quite diverse, and perhaps even more diverse than they are today. Then we move through Cornwall's industrial history. Of course, our industrial links and obviously powered British colonialism and the slave trade, like the invention of the steam engine, for example. And so we talk about how there are links there with Black history and world history. Then we look at the abolition movement and how Cornwall actually played its part in the abolition movement, and we'll give some stories in this presentation around that. Then we're going to move through of the First and Second World Wars. We actually had troops that were African American who was based here, and that impacted our local population because lots of those troops had babies with local women. So that changed some of our population. Then we're going to move up to the present day. So let's start this presentation. As I said, this is just an overview, and if you want to get more information, please do contact us through Hypatia to get the full details. Now, the Black Tudors are a fascinating topic and something that's very much overlooked in British Black history, because often we start it at the transatlantic slave trade, when actually lots of African diaspora lived around this country and in Cornwall as free people. So we know, for instance, that Emmanuel the Moor was based in Truro and that he had children. Now, we know that his daughter Maria is buried in Cornwall, and we've got her dated, her burial, as 1611. We can also find that she had a younger brother, Richard, that was baptised in 1612. Now, from what we can gather, Emmanuel the Moor lived independently. He earned an independent income. There's no record of him being in service. He died in 1623 and is buried in Cornwall as well. So this is the earliest record of African diaspora family living in Cornwall. Then we move on to the Barbary pirates. Now, this is an interesting period. So the Barbary pirates were from northwest Africa. They're an Arabic people, and many of them came over to Cornwall and raided. There was lots of raiding going on all over the shop, to be honest, in Europe and through Africa. So this was commonplace, and basically the Barbary pirates would raid Cornwall, and they did steal hundreds of Cornish people as slaves. Thomas Pellow is one of the sort of more prominent examples of that, because he did survive and become free and actually wrote his memoirs. So we know the story of Thomas Pellow, which you can get on Amazon if you're interested to find out more about that. So then we move on to the transatlantic slave trade. Now, the transatlantic slave trade dwarfed all other slave trades. So we're talking around 12.5 million Africans. Now, Britain was a huge player in that. Around 70% of the trade was either Britain or Portugal. So, as I said earlier, we know that the first slave ship left from Truro, so that links Cornwall in immediately. After that, there weren't very many ships going from Cornwall. However, we do know that Truro at one time in the 1600s was nicknamed Caribbean Island. Now, that's around sort of the Washington Place area in Truro. Now, that is because there used to be a dock there, and slave ships would dock at that port, and they were seen at the port. So that they were probably docked there on their way to the Caribbean. There wasn't a slave population in Britain, so they would have been then moved on to the Caribbean from Africa. So yes, there is some evidence. Now, there were also some ships that sunk off of Cornwall. And in 1843, the schooner ship sunk off of St Ives with Manillas on board. Now, Manillas were made in Birmingham, and they were taken to Africa, and they were traded for slaves. So they were sort of a metal object. So Manillas and also African tusks, which are found in shipwrecks around Cornwall, are evidence of the traffic that was flowing past Cornwall that was linked to the slave trade. Now, we know that Cornwall did have its fair share of slave traders. Around 17 addresses in Cornwall had payouts from the government when slavery was abolished. Thomas Crocker of Falmouth in 1669, he married an African woman and developed a family business of supplying slaves. His mother's house is documented to have having slaves as servants. So although technically slavery didn't happen in Cornwall in terms of we didn't have any plantations, but we did have enslaved people that were basically in houses of people that were linked to slavery. So we can see that, and we can see that in the parish records, which is very sad, and we can actually see that they are documented as property of people. So we can see there that they are documented in parish records in the archives. Now, the Price family owned Jamaican slave plantations up until the abolition period. Rose Price was quite a character. He was known to have been very cruel to his slaves, and he would also walk around Penzance with them. So again, he is another slave owner that used to bring slaves to his home in Cornwall. So again, that is now evidence of enslaved people in Cornwall. Now, archive documents support all of this, and you can go and look in Crens and Kernow if you'd like to see some of those documents. Now, if we move on to Cornish maritime history. Now, Cornish maritime history is really interesting in terms of Black history, because we know that the Falmouth packet ships took mail from the colonies, and they had a lot of Black employed mariners. So we know that William Beckford, which was a wealthy plantation owner, and he commented about the diversity in Falmouth in the 1700s. So, I mean, in its day, you could say around 30% of pirates were Black and around 3% of British mariners were Black. So these were free people, and it seems that there seemed to be more freedom during this period actually at sea than there was on land, which could obviously be very dangerous on land in the Americas, in Africa, in terms of being captured and taken into slavery. We have also seen evidence of people who were free Black British mariners who were captured at sea and then sold into slavery. So that sort of thing also went on. And also there's examples of even white mariners that were sold into slavery. So we know that there was plus 60. Just leave that bit. So then if we look at Equinano is quite a interesting story, which links a enslaved child of the Kingdom of Benin, which is modern day Nigeria. And he was actually sent to school in England while he was an enslaved person by his master. and he visited Falmouth as a child, which is evidence of slave owners again bringing slaves to stay with their Cornish families. Now, Equiano actually bought his own freedom. He bought his own freedom by managing to save up while he was working as an enslaved person on a ship. And he worked in the abolition movement and wrote the first book, which basically details the narrative of an enslaved person. He actually died a very rich man. So that's a really interesting story, and you can read his memoirs, and you can read what he said about Falmouth and how he described Falmouth. So that's a very interesting testimony. And it's testimonies like this that really shaped the abolition movement. And again, another example is Joseph Emedy. So Joseph Emedy was also an enslaved person who was captured in West Africa. He was sold to the Portuguese, and his slave master actually taught him to play the violin and play in the Lisbon Orchestra. And then while he was playing in the Lisbon Orchestra, he was kidnapped by a press gang from it was actually a British naval officer that hired the press gang to kidnap him. And he enslaved him for entertainment. And he set him free then in Falmouth. Now Emedy then lived as a free man in Truro, teaching music, and he had a family. He got married and he had children. He was Europe's first black composer, and he actually ended up working in the Hall for Cornwall. And there's lots of interesting evidence that he was very successful as a composer. He had a good life down here, it seems, but we do know that when he travelled to London with his orchestra, there was an incident where the London Orchestra wouldn't allow him to play because he was black. So that is some evidence there of racism. So there is some evidence there of racism in London that actually wasn't present at that particular time in Cornwall. Interestingly, his daughters owned businesses in Truro. They were really successful women. I mean, you've got to bear in mind this was the 1700s, and these were mixed heritage women, and they owned a greengrocer's and a dressmaking shop in Truro. So they're very much middle class women. His sons were also very successful. They left Cornwall to become musicians. They were extremely successful people. So that's some interesting sort of testimony, really, of some people's lives, a mixed heritage family living in Cornwall and what their lives might have been like. Then we've got Richard Lander. Now, I've included Richard Lander in this presentation on Cornish Black history because Richard Lander was a Cornish explorer, and he discovered the Niger River mouth. Now, this is a really important development because the British government were at the end of slavery. They were trying to find something to replace the slave trade. So they wanted to know more about the wealthy places in Africa. Now, his discovery then changed the landscape because by him discovering that, not to say this was his fault, he was just an explorer, and he died when he was actually on the expedition when he was only 30. But his discovery had a huge impact, which led the way to what we call the scramble for Africa. So what happened is in the 1880s, this is after the abolition, a lot of Africa got divided up by the European nations, and remains that way to this day. So that changed Africa forever. Now, likewise, a lot of the Cornish inventors also had a big impact on world history and black history. So Cornwall is famous for its invention of steam, for example. We all know Richard Trevithick and William Murdoch, and they very much powered the Industrial Revolution and, of course, then also the transatlantic slave trade. So Cornish steam engines and miners were sought after for their skills all over the world. So that meant Cornish people actually moved to a lot of countries, and some of those were such as South Africa. And then we have William Murdoch, who was one of the inventors involved in steam. There is evidence that he knowingly profited from slavery as he helped make steam engines for sugar plantations in Jamaica. He is linked to the Soho foundry, which made a lot of the sugar mills, plantations, steam engines. So that's actually something that we've found out that hasn't been published before. So this was an untold story that's really exclusive to our research. So there you are, William Murdoch, who of course we celebrate in Redruth every year for Murdoch Day, did actually benefit and profit from the slave trade. Now, also in terms of mining, Camborne School of Mines trained international students. This was right up until the 1990s. So many Africans came to Cornwall to train, and many stayed and had families. Now, one really interesting story during the period of the transatlantic slave trade is that of John Brown. Now, this is a story which I think should be taught in every school in Cornwall, because I think that not only is it a great example of Black Cornish history, Black British history, but it also tells us so much about our wider Cornish history and world history. So really links everything together, this story. It's fascinating. So John Brown was born in 1810. He was an enslaved person. He was born onto basically cotton plantations in Georgia. He escaped from slavery several times, 3 times, and he got caught every time, dragged back brutally into slavery, and he managed to, in the end, escape through the Underground Railroad. Now, the Underground Railroad was what was known as the passage that went from the southern states right up to Canada, and that was founded by Harriet Tubman. So that's another really interesting story about African American history, which is worth looking into. It's fascinating. And so John Brown was able to escape on that Underground Railroad, which is sort of named. It's named an Underground Railroad, but actually what it was like a series of people that helped slaves basically escape. So people would take them in at different stages, hide them, give them lifts, give them food, and they would work their way all the way up to Canada. And then some of them would get on the boats in Canada and come over to England, because in England, by the 1800s, of course, we had already abolished slavery. So when John Brown made it to the north, he befriended some Cornish miners. Now, he did that deliberately because slavery had been abolished in England. He very much felt that English people were his ally. So he settled with them and he worked in the mines in Northern America. Now, these miners gave him work, and they also gave him the promise of work in Cornwall, because John's ambition was very much to work for a bit in the north in America and then get a ship over to England, where he felt he would be far enough away that he wouldn't be recaptured and dragged back into slavery. So that was his aim, So he travelled from Detroit to Liverpool, and then he made a beeline for Redruth in Cornwall. So when he got to Redruth, he found that the person that he was meant to see to give him work had died. But he met his son, and he was very much taken in by him, and he ended up working in the local mines here in Redruth. Now, what's interesting about this story is the local churches, the Wesleyan faith, asked him to give talks about his experience. So the local Wesleyan churches were huge abolitionists, and they were very important in the abolition movement. So they actually took him in. They took him around to the different churches, and he decided he would dedicate the rest of his life to the abolition movement, because although he was free, he wanted to have it abolished in America. So that's what he did, and he wrote a fascinating book, which you can read, which you can get on Amazon. You can get John Brown's memoirs on Amazon, and it's a really interesting read. It's fascinating what he says about his experiences in slavery and how he came to come to Redruth and work down the mines. And also at the back of the book, what's interesting is it has a number of testimonies from people in Cornwall who gave testimonies to him, and basically references. So it's really interesting to see how Cornwall played its part there in the abolition movement. And we know, as I've already said, that the Wesleyan churches were a big part of that. And actually, a lot of Wesleyans boycotted sugar in their tea. And to this day, a lot of Wesleyan families still don't have sugar in their tea, and they may not know why, but it actually originates from the Wesleyans being abolitionists. So in 1772, slavery was banned in England. In 1807, slave trade was abolished on trading on British ships. And in 1834, slavery was abolished in the British colonies. In 1865, the US abolished its slave trade. So now we do know that there is some evidence that these dates weren't clean cut, and actually it did happen illegally after some of those dates. Now we're going to move on. We're going to jump forward now on our timeline and look at the World Wars. Now, British troops were based here in Cornwall, and African American troops were stationed in Cornwall to help the Second World War efforts. So the African American troops were subject to military segregation laws. They were actually subject to Jim Crow laws while they were staying on base in Cornwall. Now, this was a massive issue. Because on the base, so you can see from this photograph, you've got the white American soldiers that are on separate benches than the African Americans. Now, what is interesting about this is the Cornish people didn't understand this. They just felt that everyone was here to help in the war, and they welcomed everyone. And of course, we didn't have segregation, so we didn't really understand America's segregation laws. This posed a real issue for the US military, who tried to maintain segregation when the local Cornish people weren't keen to abide. So there were some really interesting examples of this, such as pubs that would, have everybody come in, African Americans and the white Americans. They would serve them all the same, and the white Americans GIs would often complain, and of course their generals would come in and complain to the the business owners that they weren't segregating. And there is an example of a publican who basically decided, he was told by the US military, you've got to have segregation. He didn't want to do that. And as a sort of a protest movement, he put a sign outside his pub and said, "No white American GIs welcome." So he was basically letting in the African Americans and banned the white GIs. So you can see there were some tensions from that. And one big incident that's happened, which actually got the whole world's attention, was in 1943 in Launceston, when a group of African American troops had a shootout in the town square. And you can actually see the bullet holes there still to this day. And because the white American troops were again conflicting and trying to say that the African American troops couldn't come down to the pubs. So a group of African American troops picked up arms and actually went and rose up against their own military discrimination. And that was suppressed, and we don't really know what happened to them. It was all very much hushed up by the military. The media weren't allowed in the courtroom in Launceston. They had like a courtroom in Launceston where the US military heard the crimes of the African American soldiers, and we don't really know what happened. It's all been covered up. So that's one thing that got the news all around the world. And from the British government's point of view, it was a real worry because, of course, we needed the US. So we didn't want to upset the US military. We needed them to fight the war. But this was something that was really a conflict issue. Now, a lot, of course, the African American troops had mixed relationships with obviously local women. And that boasted the British black population by 30%. With over 2,000 mixed heritage babies being born. Now, the Cornwall would have had a quite large amount of those as well. And we do know that although many of the white Cornish mothers did keep their children, we do know that lots of mixed heritage war babies were sent to Devon to a school which was called to a boarding school. So it's quite sad, to a boarding school. Now, another story during the Second World War, which is fascinating, is the princesses in Penzance. So during the Second World War, Ethiopia had a lot of unrest, and the Haile Selassie, who was the last emperor of Ethiopia, he was sent into exile. So he came to Britain, he fled to Britain with his family, and that included his granddaughters. And he put his granddaughters in school in Penzance. So these two little princesses ended up in a Penzance school. And we know that they were very welcomed and that everyone was very excited when Haile Selassie actually visited Cornwall. So we know that that was met very well locally. Now, of course, if you don't know, Haile Selassie is a very important character for the Rastafari religion. Selassie is basically seen as a king. He is regarded as being related to Jesus through King David. So he is really held up high by the Rastafarian people. So it's quite interesting that Selassie has this link to Cornwall. It's quite a cool fact. And what was also interesting is when the princesses grew up and they went back to Ethiopia, one of them did, Adai, she basically was then imprisoned in Ethiopia during the revolution in 74. And she was put in prison for 14 years. Now, during that time, with no charges, this was a human rights breach, and she was actually, there was a big campaign that went around the world, human rights campaign for her and her family's release. And part of that campaign included Penzance people and the local MP who actually, a lot of those people who went to school with the princesses thought, very highly of them, and they campaigned for their freedom. So that's another sort of interesting little story about how Cornish history kind of links in with other world history events and Black history. Now, just to end off this presentation, of course, post-World War, we had the Windrush period where lots of immigration came in from the Commonwealth, and of course that changed the population. And then we have, of course, the Civil Rights Movement in America, coupled with a lots of race relation acts in Britain, which were tackling discrimination in things like employment and housing. And all of these things have paved the way for today, where we have a much more diverse Cornwall. And since the COVID pandemic, Cornwall has also had almost doubled, as Devon, its non-white population. So certainly Cornwall today is becoming more and more diverse. Now, one celebrity out of Cornwall, which you may not have known was from Penzance, is Thandie Newton, a big Hollywood actress. Thandie was actually raised in Cornwall. She wasn't born here. She was born in Zimbabwe, but her family lived here and she was raised here. She went to school here. She got into arts here. And of course, she went on to basically, become a massive Hollywood success. And you can see she actually wrote in a Cornish children's book about Cornwall and her childhood here, which she thinks of very fondly. And she describes Cornwall is the end of the road and the port of the world. And I think that really sums up this presentation, because it's because Cornwall is a port, because of obviously the way we had lots of ports over those last 500 years. Because of that, we've had so much movement of people, trade. There's so many significant events that have come to our shores, and that is what has impacted and put us really on the map, and has interacted us with world history and Black history. So that's the end of this presentation. Again, I'll just draw you back to if you want to get the book. If you want to get the book, please do contact the Hypatia Trust.